The riot at the well started over a bucket, and it very nearly killed a child, and it was entirely my fault. Not because I had built the well badly, but because I had built it for 200 people and there were now 940. I was up at the north wall with Bram when I heard it. Not the sound of a fight, which is sharp and has edges, but the low, ugly swell of a crowd going wrong, which has no edges at all and is far worse. By the time I got down to the square, the queue at the wellhead had stopped being a queue. 400 people had come for the morning water in a space built for 40, and somewhere in the middle of it, a man had pushed, and a woman had pushed back, and the whole mass had surged against the low stone lip of the shaft, and a boy of 6 had gone down under it. Myra had him out before I reached them. She had waded into 400 panicking people with her shoulder and her voice, and hauled the child out by the back of his shirt, and she was standing over him with her face like a hatchet while his mother screamed, and the crowd was still pressing, and I saw the whole thing in one flat professional instant the way I always see these things, not as a tragedy but as a load path, a mass of bodies with a single point of egress and no way to shed pressure, exactly the way a stair fails in a fire. I got up on the wellhead coping and I put my voice across them, and here is the true and unflattering part. It took me 3 tries. A year ago it would not have worked at all. Now it worked on the third, and the crowd came apart into people again, and the boy lived, and had a cracked collarbone and a story he would tell badly for 40 years. Nobody died. That was the only good thing about the morning, and I did not let myself take much comfort from it, because a lord who congratulates himself on the disaster he nearly had is a lord who will shortly have the real one. Myra found me afterward with the boy's blood on her sleeve and her jaw set. That's the 3rd crush this month. It's just the first one that put a child on the ground. She did not soften it because Myra never did and because she had earned the right not to. We're drawing that shaft near dry by midday now, and folk queue from dark because if you're late there's nothing till evening. You gave us water, Aldric, but you gave it to a village, and this isn't a village anymore. Whatever you're going to do about it, do it before the frost, or we'll be melting snow in pots and burying the ones who can't. She was right, and she was right about the harder thing underneath it too, which she was too decent to say out loud, that the crush was not a water problem. It was a me problem. 900 people had come to the Ashmarch because word had gone out that there was a lord here who fed his people, and I had let them come. Every one of them a hand I needed and a life I had taken responsibility for without laying the pipe to carry them. That is not a flood. That is a design brief you accepted and then failed to draw. So I went and stood alone on the flats north of the town for most of an afternoon, and I did what I have done before every real project of either of my lives, which is nothing at all. I looked at the ground, and I let the problem be exactly as large as it actually was, because the single most expensive mistake in engineering is solving the small version of a problem you have not finished measuring. The small version was, dig another well. That was what any lord on this frontier would have done, and it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong within about 10 minutes. Another shaft meant another queue, another crush, another single point of failure, and the same conversation with Myra in 8 months when we were 1400. Worse, the sweet water under Duncairn sat in a lens, a body of fresh water floating on the heavier brine beneath, and every new shaft you sink into a lens draws it down and pulls the salt up behind it. 2 wells would not give me twice the water. 2 wells would give me 1 poisoned aquifer and a town that had to leave. I knew that because I had learned it the hard way in my first month here, when I had put a shaft down 40 feet expecting sweet water and brought up brine, a perched salt lens sitting above the fresh, a thing no survey from the surface can see and no glowing panel in my head thought to mention, because the Dominion showed me water and did not distinguish kind. I had learned 2 permanent lessons from that hole. The first was to never again trust a reading I had not tested at depth, which is why every shaft in the Ashmarch now got sampled at 3 levels before I would sign it, and why there was a row of little clay cups on a shelf in my workroom with the date and depth scratched on each one. The second was that this ground was layered, and treacherous, and would not tolerate being drawn hard in any one place, which meant the answer was not a bigger hole. The answer was to stop taking water out of Duncairn at all. There is fresh water in the Ashmarch. There is a great deal of it. It simply is not here. It is in the spring-fed pools under the low scarp at Corey's Fault, 9 miles northwest, where the rock breaks and the water that falls on the uplands comes out clean and cold and runs 100 yards into the salt and dies. Kessa had shown me the place in my second month. Every soul in Duncairn knew about it. Nobody had ever once considered it a water supply, and I want to be fair about why, because it was not stupidity. It was that 9 miles of the flattest ground in the Empire lies between there and here, and you cannot carry water across flat ground. Water does not go anywhere without a fall, and that country looks to the eye, to any eye, perfectly, absolutely level. Looks level. That was the whole of it. That was the crack in the wall. Because ground that looks flat is almost never flat, and the human eye is a contemptible instrument for judging a gradient. I had spent 12 years in a world of laser levels and total stations precisely because the eye lies about slope at scales below about 1 in 50, and I had a strong suspicion. From the way the winter runoff pooled south of the pans, from the way the old stream bed ran, from the salt crusting deeper toward the town, that the Ashmarch was not flat at all. I thought it fell slightly toward Duncairn. If it fell even 5 feet in 9 miles, I could bring that spring to the town square without a single pump, and it would run forever and it would never queue. I did not know if it fell, so I went and measured it. The instrument I built to survey the Ashmarch cost about 4 coppers and took call an afternoon, and it is the thing I am proudest of in my whole first year on that frontier, because it is the purest example of what I actually am. Not a man with a magic panel in his head, but a man who knows which question the ground will answer. You cannot sight a level by eye over 9 miles, but water is a liar that never lies about one thing, its own surface. Put water in 2 open vessels and join them with a tube, and the surface in each will settle at precisely the same height above the center of the world, every time, without exception, and it does not care what you believe or how flat the ground looks. It is the oldest instrument there is. The Romans ran aqueducts on it. All I needed was 2 clay basins, a long tube of oiled and tarred leather hose that caul and the tanner made up in lengths, and a pair of graduated staffs, 2 straight poles marked off in even bands. The principle takes 1 sentence. You set the 2 basins a hose length apart, you let the water settle, and where the water sits in each basin is the same height. Read the mark on the staff at each end, take the difference, and you have measured the fall of the ground between those 2 points to within a finger's width. Then you leapfrog the back basin to the front and do it again, and again, and again, 240 times if the distance is 9 miles. It is agonizingly slow and completely, brutally exact, and no one on the Ashmarch had ever seen it done. I took Kessa because she could walk 9 miles backwards and still see everything, and Tam because he would have followed me into a furnace, and 2 of Bram's steadiest lads, and we went out at dawn and we surveyed for 11 days. Set, settle, read, record. Move. Set, settle, read, record. Tam kept the tally on wax and did not once ask why we were doing it, which is its own kind of faith. Kessa asked constantly, and I explained it every time, and by the 4th day she had understood it well enough to catch a bad reading before I did, which is when I stopped thinking of her as a scout who could be taught and started thinking of her as an apprentice. On the 7th day, we hit the thing I had been quietly dreading, which was a stretch of 2 miles that rose. Not much. 11 inches. But water will not climb 11 inches for you no matter how badly you need it to, and if that rise sat between the spring and the town, the whole idea was dead, and I had spent 11 days proving I could not have what I wanted. I want to be precise about what I did next, because it is the difference between the man I am and the man that first-month brine hole made me look like. I did not curse the ground, and I did not push on hoping it would come right, and I absolutely did not decide to run the line anyway and find out later with 400 men's labor already in it. I stopped. I sent Kessa 2 miles east and 2 miles west with the second staff to find the ends of the rise, and I mapped the shape of the thing over a day and a half, and I established that it was not a ridge across our path at all. It was the toe of an old dune field, and it ended. A mile and a half to the west there was a gap where the ground kept falling clean the whole way. The line was not 9 miles. The line was 11 and a quarter, curving west around the toe of a dune nobody had ever noticed was there because it is 11 inches high and looks exactly like everything else. And the total fall from the spring pool to Duncairn Square, measured, checked, and re-walked in reverse to catch my own errors, was 14 feet and 4 inches. 14 feet, over 11 miles. A gradient of about 1 in 4,000, which is nothing, which is a hair, which is less than the thickness of your thumb dropped over the length of a longhouse. It is also, and this is the entire point, enough. Water will run down 1 in 4,000 quite happily forever, provided, and here is where the design actually lives, provided the channel is smooth and covered, and its gradient never once goes backwards over 11 miles of construction by men who have never built anything like it in their lives. That last clause is the hard part. That is the whole engineering problem, and it is not a problem of knowing. It is a problem of control. I laid it out over 3 nights in my workroom, and I did not hurry it, and I want to set down what it was, because it is the only monument I have ever built that I would put my name on. A covered stone conduit, 11 and a quarter miles, from the spring pool at Corey's Fault to a header tank above Duncairn Square. Rectangular section, 1.5 feet wide by 2 deep, sized not for the water we needed, but for the water a town of 3,000 would need, because building it twice is the most expensive thing you can possibly do. Laid on a prepared bed of rammed clay and gravel, covered with capping slabs the whole way, because an open channel in this country is an evaporation loss of 1/3 and a wind-blown saltansond contamination of everything you drink. 2 settling basins along the run to drop out silt, with draw-off gates so they can be cleaned without stopping the flow. And at the town end, a header tank, raised on a stone plinth, feeding not 1 outlet but 9 public fountains, spread across the whole of Duncairn, each one running continuously into a stone trough with an overflow to the drainage ditch. 9 outlets. That was the part I cared most about, and it had nothing to do with hydraulics. Myra's crush happened because 1,000 people had one place to stand. Give them 9, running day and night, never running dry, never needing to be queued for at all, and you do not need to manage the crowd because there is no crowd. You do not solve a riot with rules. You solve it by removing the scarcity that made the line, and the frost. It goes without saying, and I will say it anyway. Buried the whole length below the frost line, because water expanding in a stone channel in midwinter will crack 11 miles of work in a single night, and there is no repair for that. There is only rebuilding. Which brings me to Bram, and to the thing I have come to understand about the men I have gathered out here. I showed him the drawing on the 4th morning, the full set, the sections, the fall table, the whole 11 and a quarter miles laid out in ink. And old Bram, who had built real works in the East before whatever it was put him on the salt with a jug, went through it in silence for a very long time. He did not correct a line of it. He would not have. The levels were surveyed and the sections were sized, and the hydraulics were not a matter of opinion. What he did instead was better, and it is exactly why he is worth 10 of any man Earl Voss owns. I've seen a thing like this once. Aqueduct at Vale when I was a boy, arches mined over a valley, not this creeping flat business. He tapped the fall table with a thick finger, almost angry with wonder. 14 feet in 11 mile. You measured that on the salt. Nobody measures the salt, boy. There's nothing to measure. It's flat. He stopped himself. It's not flat, is it? It's never flat. It just doesn't tell you unless you make it. He was quiet again. Then he pulled the drawing round and put his ruined hands on it and gave me the 4 things I did not have, and could not have had, and would have been a fool not to ask for. Right, then hear me, because you've drawn it true and now you need it to stand. 1. Not the pale stone from the near cut, whatever it costs you in cartage. Pale spalls, it's got the brine in it, and the first hard frost'll shell it off in flakes and your capping's gone. You want the gray from the old quarry at Hask, it drinks nothing. 2. Your frost line. You've written 3 foot. In the east 3 foot. Out here the wind strips the cover off the flats and the cold drives deeper. I've seen ground broke at 4.5. That winter the sheep died. Bury at 5. 3. Your clay bed, the salt flat clay goes to porridge in a thaw. You'll want it packed with the gravel from the old stream bed, 1 to 3, and rammed wet in layers. And 4, and here he actually smiled, which on Bram's face is an alarming event. 4. You'll not get 11 mile of trench dug to a hair by 400 people who have never dug a trench. Not without you standing over every yard of it, and you can't stand over 11 mile. Gray stone from Hask. 5 feet, not 3. Gravel-bound clay rammed wet. Not one of those is a correction. Every one of them is this country, the stone that has brine in it, the wind that strips the flats, the thaw that turns the clay, the frost that broke the ground the winter the sheep died. I had the principles. Bram had 40 years of what this specific ground does to men who ignore it, and a modern engineer who will not take that from the man who has it deserves the wall he gets. And his 4th point was not about stone at all. It was about me. And he was completely right, and it was the only part of the whole project that actually frightened me, because the gradient was 1 in 4,000, which meant that anywhere along 11.25 miles, a work gang that decided a section of trench was near enough, or that a stone sat close enough to level, or that they would make up the difference further along, anywhere a man did it his own way instead of my way, the water would stop. Not leak, stop. A single backfall of 3 inches anywhere, and I would have an 11-mile stone reservoir full of standing water and 9 dry fountains and 940 people who had spent a winter's labor on it. The engineering was finished. It was correct, and I knew it was correct. What I did not yet have was any reliable way to make 400 people build it exactly as drawn, over 11 miles, out of my sight. That is not a drawing board problem. That is a command problem. And command, as the cold glowing panel in my head had been telling me since the morning I arrived, was the number I had always been worst at. I solved it the way I have solved every management problem in 2 lifetimes, which is by refusing to rely on anyone's goodwill, including my own presence. You do not get 11 miles of 1 in 4,000 trench by exhorting people. You do not get it with speeches, or loyalty, or by threatening anybody, and you certainly do not get it by standing over each gang, because there is one of you and there are 400 of them, and the section that goes wrong will always be the one you are not standing in. You get it by making the correct thing the easy thing, and by making error visible the same day it happens, and by never once requiring a laborer to understand hydraulics in order to do his job properly. So I did not ask anyone to build to a gradient. I took the gradient away from them entirely. We made templates, 240 of them, a simple wooden frame, a crosspiece and 2 legs, cut so that when you set it in the trench and the little pendulum bob hung true against the notch, the bed beneath it was at exactly the right depth for that station, and every template was numbered to its station and could not be used at any other. Call and the carpenters cut them off a single master in 3 days. A man in the trench did not need to know what a gradient was, or that the water would run, or anything at all about the 11 miles either side of him. He needed to dig until the frame sat down and the bob hung in the notch. That was the whole of his instruction. If the bob hung true, his yard was right to a finger's width, and it was right whether he cared or not, whether he liked me or not, and whether I was standing there or 9 miles away. That is what engineering actually is, and I have never been able to explain it to anyone who has not done it. You do not build correctness out of virtue. You build it out of a jig. Then, because a template only tells you about the yard it is sitting in, I built the check on top of it. Every evening, the gang leader of each section walked his length with the water level and read 3 stations at random against the marked staff, and Tam collected the readings on a wax tablet and brought them to me at supper, and I plotted the whole 11 miles as a running line on a board on my workroom wall, not because I did not trust them. Because no system that relies on trust survives contact with tired people at the end of a cold day, and because a 3-inch error found the same evening costs an hour and a 3-inch error found in spring costs the season. We caught 11 of them over the build. 9 were honest, soft ground settling, a template lifted and reset carelessly. 2 were not, and both of those were the same thing, and it is the thing Bram had warned me about. A gang that had decided to cut the corner because they were cold and it was late and near enough is near enough, and had backfilled a low section to save redigging it, and had said nothing. Here is where a lord who has learned his lesson does not shout. I took the whole of that gang out to the section the next morning, and I did not dress anyone down, and I did not hang anybody's name on a post. I set the level up in front of them, and I had their own gang leader read the staff at the 2 ends of their length, out loud, and then I had him read the station 300 yards down where the trench was true, and I let the 3 numbers sit in the air. Then I took a bucket of water and poured it into their section, and we all watched it lie there and not move, in a channel that was supposed to carry a town, and I said the only thing that needed saying, which was that water cannot be talked round and does not care that it was late and cold, and that this length would be dug again by the men who had filled it, and that nobody would be fined a copper because I would rather have men who tell me when they get it wrong than men who hide it well. And then I did the part that actually mattered, which took me a week and cost me 30 silver. I paid the gangs by the corrected yard, measured and signed off at the evening reading, instead of by the day. A man who is paid by the day is paid to be cold and tired in a trench. A man who is paid by the yard that passes the level is paid to make the bob hang true, and will fix his own errors before I ever see them, because an error is now his own coin, and he will also fight the man beside him who is dragging the section's rate down. I did not have to enforce quality after that. 400 people enforced it on each other, all day, for 11 miles, at no cost in my attention whatsoever. It rose 1 number on the panel, which is nothing, and it was the most useful thing that happened to me all winter, because command, I was finally understanding, is not the ability to make men obey you. Gareth could make men obey him. He had 40 years of it in his voice, and I will never have that. Command is the ability to arrange matters so that 1,000 decisions you are not present for come out right anyway. That is a thing you design. And designing systems that work without me standing in them happens to be, precisely, the trade I spent 12 years learning in a world with cranes. 61 days. Through the frost, with a break of 9 days when the ground froze too hard to cut and we quarried instead. 11¼ miles of covered stone conduit, 2 settling basins, a header tank, 9 fountains, 400 people, and a total labor cost that would have bought Earl Voss a decent horse. The morning we opened it, I put Bram at the spring end with the gate, because it was his stone and his frost line and his 5 feet, and I stood in the town square with 940 people and 9 dry fountains and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say, and because I was, if I am honest, not completely certain. A thing can be right on paper and right in every reading and still fail on a detail you did not think of. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never opened anything. It took 40 minutes for the water to come down 11 miles. I have never in either life experienced a longer 40 minutes. Then the first fountain coughed and spat brown and ran clear. And then the other 8, one after another across the town, and the sound that went up out of Duncairn was the sound I had heard once before. On the wall after the battle, that low shaking disbelieving roar of people discovering that a thing they had been told all their lives was impossible had simply been done in front of them by their own hands. Water. 9 places. Running by itself, out of flat dead ground, from a spring 9 miles away that everybody knew about and nobody had ever been able to use. Kessa put her whole head under one of them in the cold and came up howling and laughing. Myra did not laugh. Myra stood in front of the nearest fountain for a long moment with her hand in the water and her hard face doing something complicated, and then she looked over at me and gave me a single short nod, and that was worth more than the roar. Old Bram came down the line at noon, filthy and shaking with cold, and stood looking at the fountain in the square for a while. 14 foot in 11 mile, he said to nobody. I've been 40 years at Stone, and I'd have told you to your face it couldn't be done on the flat. I'd have laughed at you." He wiped his nose with the back of a ruined hand. "There'll be men drinking out of this in 100 years, and not one of them'll know your name. That's the job, Bram. That's the entire job." I did not tell him the other thing, which was that I already knew what the aqueduct actually was, and it was not water. 9 miles of covered stone conduit is the single most conspicuous thing on 100 miles of empty frontier. It is visible from the road. It cannot be hidden, it cannot be moved, and it cannot be mistaken for the work of a dying salt village with a boy warden. Every trader coming up the coast track would see it. Every one of Earl Voss's factors and every hollow-eyed villager in Blackmore would hear about it inside a month. I had just announced, in 11 miles of stone, that the Ashmarch was not a place men came to die. And I had done it in the exact season when the man who ruled this march had settled in to starve my ground and wait. The answer came 8 days later, and it did not come from Blackmore. It came from the south, in grey and green, and it was not a threat at all. Lady Cassia Varon came to Duncairn with 4 riders, no herald and no warning, which told me a great deal about her before I ever heard her voice. A great house traveling properly sends word ahead so the host has time to be impressed. A great house traveling quietly is doing one of 2 things: hiding the visit or refusing to give the host time to arrange a performance. She was doing both. Her father's colors were on the horses and not on her, and she came up the coast track in a plain traveling cloak on a very good horse, and she did not announce herself at the gate. She rode straight past the gate, along the line of the new conduit, and stopped where the aqueduct came down off the low rise into the header tank. She sat there and looked at it for a quarter of an hour before she came into the town. I know because Kessa was watching her the whole time and reported it with enormous satisfaction, and because I had by then made a habit of noticing what people look at when they think nobody is measuring them. Earl Voss had looked at me. Lord Harrow had looked at my grain carts. Lady Cassia Varon looked at 11 miles of covered stone and read it the way I read a river, and when she finally rode into the square and swung down in front of the fountain, she did not greet me first. She put her hand in the water, the way Myra had, and she said, "There's no fall out here. I rode the whole 11 miles of it, and there's no fall in that country at all." She looked up. Emerald green eyes, very direct, the kind of attention that does not blink politely. "So either you have found a way to make water climb, Warden, or you have measured a slope that nobody in 400 years has been able to see. Which is it? And do not be modest. I have had 3 days on a horse, and I would rather have the answer than the manners. I have been asked a great many questions since I came to this world. That was the first one I actually enjoyed. 14 feet and 4 inches, I said. Over 11¼ miles. It just falls too slowly for an eye to catch. Eyes are bad instruments. Water isn't." I gestured at the basin. 2 bowls and a hose. Water finds its own level always everywhere. You leapfrog it 240 times and the ground has to tell you the truth. She was quiet for a moment. Then something went across her face that I would come to know very well, and which I have never seen on any other person. A kind of hard delight, the look of someone who has been waiting a long time to meet somebody who does not need things explained twice. 2 bowls and a hose, she repeated. My father spent 1,100 crowns 3 summers ago having a mill race cut, and his engineer told him the ground could not be surveyed and it would have to be dug by eye. It was dug by eye. It runs backwards for 40 yards and the mill has never worked properly since. She pulled off her riding gloves, finger by finger, still looking at me. And you did 900 crowns worth of impossible with 2 bowls and a hose, in a town that was a graveyard 11 months ago. Warden Vale, I am going to be extremely direct with you, because I have not come here to be charming and I don't believe you'd enjoy it if I tried. Is there somewhere we can speak where your steward can hear and nobody else can?" That was Cassia. That has always been Cassia. She had ridden 3 days into a march where a corrupt earl was actively trying to murder its lord, without a herald, and inside 4 minutes of dismounting she had established what I was worth, told me a humiliating story about her own father to prove she was not there to posture, and asked for the room. I liked her immediately, and I want to be honest about that, and equally honest about the fact that liking her was, that first afternoon, entirely beside the point. I had 940 people, a hostile earl, a frozen trade, and a promise to a man about his daughter that I had no idea how to keep. What I felt looking at Lady Cashivaran was not what a younger man feels. It was closer to what I felt the first time the Dominion showed me Bram asleep against a wall with a jug in his lap. There is far more here than anyone around this person has ever bothered to use. I took her to the workroom, and I put Osric in the corner with his tablets, and she looked once at the board on my wall, the 11-mile fall plotted as a running line, with the 11 caught errors marked in a different ink, and she sat down and told me, without any softening whatsoever, that I was losing. "You think Earl Voss went quiet because you boxed him," she said. "You think he canceled the reavers, recalled his men off the coast road, and settled in to strangle your trade and wait for a bad winter. That's what he wanted you to think, and it is roughly a third of the truth." She laid 3 fingers on the table, one at a time. "He has spent this entire season doing 3 things you have not seen, because they are not happening on your frontier. They are happening at court. Would you like them, in order of how badly they hurt?" "Please." "First, your tribute. You bound yourself in that very clever letter to pay the lawful charter due of the Ashmarch, a fraction of what he demanded, and you made it public so he could not extort more. It was beautifully done, and I laughed out loud when my father's clerk read it to me. No flattery in it, a statement of assessment. Voss has not challenged it. Voss has accepted it in writing to the justiciar, and then petitioned the Crown's Chancery for a review of the Ashmarch Charter, on the grounds that a march yielding so little tribute is plainly mis-set, and its schedule should be revised to reflect its true and improved capacity. He is not fighting your letter, Warden. He is using it. You made the lawful due the only thing he may demand. So now he is going to have the lawful due raised, by the Crown, on the public record, with your own honest accounting as the evidence." I sat with that for a moment. It was, I recognized with a kind of cold professional admiration, exactly the move I would have made. "Second, he has not said one word against you, not one. He speaks of you at court. I have heard him twice with enormous warmth, the promising young Vale on his western march. Such energy, such ambition." She let the word sit. "And then he mentions, sorrowfully in passing to a different person each time, that the boy has raised a curtain wall without license, that he has armed and drilled a militia of 400, that he has opened a trade route that pays no toll to any chartered holder, and now this is the new one. This is why I rode that he has built an 11-mile aqueduct in a single winter." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you know what that list is, Warden?" I did. I had known since the second item, and I felt the floor of the thing drop away underneath me. "It's a domain," I said. "It's not a list of a warden's works. It's an inventory of a man building a seat, wall, garrison, independent trade, public waterworks." I heard my own voice go flat. "He's not accusing me of anything. He's just describing me, accurately, and letting the description do the work. There it is." She looked genuinely pleased that I had got there without help, and then entirely unsentimental about what it meant. A frontier warden holds a march in his lord's name. He does not raise fortifications. He does not maintain a standing levy, and he certainly does not commission public works, because those are the acts of a lord ceding a domain, and a man ceding a domain without leave is doing it against somebody. Every single thing you have built to keep your people alive is also, read in a chancery, evidence. He has not told one lie. He does not need to. You have been assembling the case against yourself all winter with your own 2 hands, and you have been so pleased with the water that you never once asked how it would look written down. That is the part I want to set down plainly, because it is the truest thing about that whole season and it does me no credit at all. The aqueduct was right. Every foot of it was right. The survey was right. The gradient was right. The frost line was right. The 9 fountains were right, and I would build it again tomorrow exactly as drawn. There was no error in it anywhere. And it did not matter in the slightest, because I had solved the problem in front of me while a man 3 days east solved the problem of me, and he had done it in a medium I had barely thought about. Not stone, not coin, not steel, but the appearance of things in rooms I had never been in front of people whose names I did not know. I build. That is what I am. And I had walked into the oldest trap there is for a man who builds, which is to assume that because a thing is good it will be seen as good, that the water arriving is the end of the argument. It is not the end of the argument. It is a fact, and facts sit there mutely and let other people narrate them. Osric had gone very still in his corner. He said, into the quiet, in the driest voice he owns, "I should have seen it, my lord. I have written for great men for 30 years, and I read the Chancery hand every day of my life, and I did not see it. He gave us a battle we won so completely that neither of us thought to ask what he was doing while we were winning it." He set his stylus down. "That is my failure. It is precisely what you keep me for." "It is not your failure, Master Osric, it is your position." She said it without unkindness, which somehow made it worse. "You are in the Ashmarch. The thing is being done in the Chancery at Aldermere and in the withdrawing rooms of 11 houses between here and the capital, and no ear you can afford reaches into those. Mine do. That is not cleverness on my part, it is birth, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." She turned back to me. "Which brings us to third. And third is the one that made me get on a horse without telling my father." "Go on." "The review has been granted. A crown assessor is coming to the Ashmarch in the spring to value your march and reset its tribute." A small pause. "He will be lodged and guided and advised the entire time he is on the frontier by the Earl of Blackmore. He will see what Voss shows him. He will be told what it means by Voss. And whatever schedule he writes will be law and will not be appealable, and if it is set high enough, which it will be, then your salt, your wall, your militia, and your 11 miles of stone all become the property of a tribute you cannot pay, and Earl Voss takes the Ashmarch off you in a courtroom, legally in daylight, without one further reaver and without ever having lied." She sat back. "He is not waiting for a drought, Warden. He is the drought, and it arrives in the spring." I did not answer for a while, and neither of them filled the silence, which is how I learned that Cashevarin and Master Osric were going to get on. What I felt was not panic. It was something more useful and much colder. The specific, familiar sensation of a project brief being handed to me late, with the design already committed, and the ground already broken, and the client's real requirement only now being explained. I have had that feeling perhaps 30 times in 2 lives. It is always the same, and the response is always the same, and the response is never to grieve about the schedule. You rescope, immediately, ruthlessly, and without any attachment to the work you have already done. "All right," I said. "Then I've been building the wrong thing all winter, not badly, wrongly. I've been solving for a frontier that has to survive an earl's steel, and the actual problem is a frontier that has to survive an earl's paperwork. Those need different structures." I pulled a fresh wax tablet over. "So let's have the brief properly. Everything I don't know. Start with the assessor. Who is he? Who pays him? What does he actually measure? And what in the whole Chancery is he frightened of?" Cassia looked at me for a long moment. And then, this is the exact instant, I think, if I had to name one, something changed in how she was sitting. "You're not going to argue with me," she said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a woman rearranging a plan. "I rode 3 days composing the speech I would have to make when you told me the water was all the argument you needed, and the crown would surely see the good of it, and that a man who had done no wrong had nothing to fear. Every lord I have ever advised has made me give that speech." "I've been in that room from the other side," I said. "The man who tells the engineer the ground is fine because he'd like it to be. He's never once been right. I tapped the tablet. You've ridden 3 days to bring me information I could not have got and would not have understood in time. I'd be an idiot to argue with it and a worse idiot not to write it down. The assessor. Go. And that is how it started between us. Not with a glance across a hall or anything of that kind, but with a woman with emerald eyes and 3 days of road on her going through the chancery of an empire for 4 hours while I filled 7 wax tablets, and Osric quietly weeping into his ledgers with professional joy because he had spent 30 years wanting somebody to talk to like that. By the time the lamps were lit, I had the shape of it. The assessor was a career chancery man named Corvin Ask, not corrupt, which was the good news and also the bad news, because a corrupt man can be bought and an honest man who is being shown a curated frontier will write an honest report full of Voss's facts. He valued a march on 3 heads: land under yield, revenue from trade and improvement, permanent works, which counted at a multiple because the crown's theory was that a lord who could raise works could afford tribute. My aqueduct under that schedule was not a gift to 900 people. It was a line in evaluation that could triple my due. So you see the trap fully now, Kasia said. Everything you build to make these people live raises the price of keeping them. Voss has arranged the frontier so that your virtue is taxed and his cruelty is not. His villages are hollow and yield nothing and are valued at nothing. That is not an accident of his character. That is why he keeps them hollow. He has known about this schedule his entire life. And there it was, laid out in a chancery valuation table, the whole moral architecture of the empire I had been fighting without fully understanding. A system that taxed a lord for feeding his people and rewarded him for starving them. Not from malice, from bookkeeping. Which is worse, and which is far harder to kill because you cannot put a bookkeeping system on a wall and shoot it. Then we don't fight the assessment, I said slowly. You can't argue a valuation down. I've watched men try and I've never once seen it work. The moment you argue the number, you've conceded the schedule. I was drawing as I said it badly, the way I always do when I am thinking. You change what he's valuing, and you change who's standing next to him when he does it. Go on. Voss gets to guide him because Voss is the ranking lord of the march and nobody else has offered. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. It isn't law, it's default. So we make a different default. If the assessor is lodged and guided by a chartered house of good standing that is not Blackmore, and if that house's hospitality is on the record with the chancery before Voss's is. I stopped, because I had just walked into something and I wanted to be sure I was walking into it with my eyes open. That's Highmore. That's what you came to offer. That's why you rode without telling your father. She did not look away. My father will not do it, she said. Let us be very clear. Count Varen will trade with you quietly at arm's length and he will write you careful letters. And if Earl Voss ever asks him directly, he will say that the Ashmarch is a promising little market and nothing more. He is 61 years old and he has spent his whole life not being noticed by Blackmore, and he is not going to stop for a boy with an aqueduct. A beat. I will do it. I keep his correspondence, I keep his house, and the chancery invitation goes out over the Highmore seal in my hand. If I send it, it is sent. He will find out when it is done, and he will be extremely angry, and then he will discover that it cannot be unsent. I want to record exactly what I said next, because a certain kind of man says no, it's too dangerous here, and that man is not being noble, he is being condescending, and he is also throwing away the one asset that can save 900 people. What does it cost you if it goes wrong? Everything I have, flat, immediate, entirely without drama. My father disowns me or is forced to. Voss marks Highmore and my brothers pay for it for 20 years. I would arrive here with a horse and a name nobody would take. She held my eyes. I have done the arithmetic, Warden, several hundred times on the road. I am not asking you to protect me from it, and I would think considerably less of you if you tried. I am telling you the price so that you know exactly what you are being handed, and so that when you spend it well. Then here is mine. I said. If Highmore's seal goes on that invitation, Voss will not go after your father. He'll go after you personally because you're the load-bearing member and he can see it. So you don't do it from Highmore. You do it from here. I turned the tablet round. Come to Duncairn as Highmore's factor for the salt trade, an open, chartered, entirely lawful posting on the record, which your father can defend to Voss as pure commerce because it is pure commerce. It puts you behind a wall 400 men died building, in a town with 9 fountains and a militia, where the Earl of Blackmore has already tried steel once and failed, and cannot afford to try it again. And it puts the Highmore seal on this side of the frontier when the invitation goes out. Kasha was silent for a good while. You just solved my problem with a load path, she said at last, and there was something in her voice I could not read at all. I came here to hand you a weapon, and you spent the first hour of it working out where I would be standing when it went off. She stood and picked up her gloves, and I understood the conversation was over because she had decided it was, which is a thing I would eventually stop finding startling. I will need a house, an office, a clerk who can be trusted, and a horse that is mine and not my father's. And I will need to be able to say honestly, if anyone asks, that the Warden of the Ashmarch and I have an arrangement of business and nothing else whatsoever. You will, I said, that's all it is. It was, too. That is the thing I would want anyone to understand about that winter. There was no glance held too long, no fumbling, nothing of the kind. There was a corrupt earl with a crown assessor coming in the spring, and there were 940 people, and there were 2 people in a cold workroom who had each spent their whole lives being the cleverest person in a room full of men who would not use them, and who had, for the first time either of us could remember, found somebody worth working with. The rest took years. But the shape of it started there, over a wax tablet and a chancery valuation table, and I have never once regretted that it began that way round. She was at the door when she stopped. There is a fourth thing, she said. I did not put it with the others because it is not politics and I did not know what to do with it. She turned. When I was last at Blackmore in the autumn, I saw a child in the Earl's household, a girl of 9 or 10, kept in the West Range with the servants, but not a servant, she is watched. I asked, the way one asks, and I was told she was a ward taken in from a village out of the Earl's charity. A pause. Her name is Elin. And Warden, I have been in that house a dozen times, and I have never once seen Earl Cadman Voss take in anything out of charity in his life. I did not move, and I hope my face did not either, because I had made a promise over a grave to a broken man who had lied to a blaze for me while his own daughter was the price. And Lady Kasha had just walked into my workroom and put the location of Hugh's child on the table like a woman laying down a card she did not yet know the value of. I told Hugh that night, because a man is owed the truth about his own child at the speed you get it, and because I had learned by then that the kindest seeming delay is almost always the Lord protecting his own comfort rather than the man's. He did not weep this time. That was worse. He sat down slowly on the bench outside the forge like a man whose legs had been taken away, and he said, in a completely flat voice, "West Range." She's in the West Range, over and over, 4 or 5 times, fitting the words into a place in himself that had been empty for 8 months. Then he looked up and asked the only question that mattered, and he asked it without any hope in it at all, because 8 months of a shuttered lantern had taught him exactly what he was worth to great men. "You're not going to try, are you, my lord? You can't. I know you can't. It's Blackmore, it's a blaze and 300 men and 40 miles, and I'm one turned spy and she's one child, and you've 900 souls here and an earl coming for all of them in the spring." He wiped his face with the heel of his hand. "You made me a promise over a grave and I've thought about it every night since and I've worked out you shouldn't keep it. So I'm releasing you from it. That's all. I wanted to say it before you had to. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this moment that is cheap, where the Lord makes a ringing declaration and the music swells. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat down on the bench next to him and did arithmetic out loud, because that is the only honest way I know to tell a man the truth. Let me tell you what it actually costs, and then you can release me if you still want to. I counted it off. I can't take Blackmore. Nobody can, not with 400 farmers, not with 4,000. I can't ransom her, because the moment I offer coin for a child, Voss knows exactly what she's worth to me, and she stops being a ward and becomes a hostage with a price, and he will never ever sell. I can't ask the crown, because a warden accusing an earl of holding a hostage with no proof is a warden the chancery stops taking letters from. And I can't send men in over the wall, because if a single one is caught, it is an armed intrusion on a lord's seat by his own vassal, which is the war Voss has spent all winter trying to make me start, and it would kill this town in a season. I let that sit. So, every straight road is closed. That's the honest accounting, and I've run it 40 times since the lady told me. That's what I thought. Which is why I've been running the crooked ones instead. I turned to look at him. Hugh, I've been to Blackmore. They kept me 2 days in the outer hall to make me feel small, and I spent both of them reading the walls because I'm no good at feeling small and I get bored. That castle has been rebuilt twice and extended once in the last 40 years. I can see the seams from the courtyard. And I have never in 2 lifetimes met a building that was extended without leaving something old buried underneath it, because no one pays men to demolish a drain. They just build over it and forget it's there. I stood up. I'm not promising you I can get her out. I'm promising you I haven't stopped working. There's a difference, and you deserve to know which one you've got. He was quiet a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. A drain, he said. You're going to take my girl out of an earl's castle through a drain. I don't know yet. That's what I have to go and find out. But I'll tell you what I do know about castles, Hugh, and it's the thing that lords never understand about their own houses. A wall is designed. A drain is accreted. The wall gets 100 men and an architect and the lord's own eye on it. The drain gets whoever was cheapest, 40 years ago, and then gets built on top of, and nobody has looked at it since. And every single lord in this empire would tell you his castle is impregnable while sitting directly above 200 feet of masonry nobody has inspected in his lifetime. I picked up my cloak. Men defend what they're proud of. Nobody's ever been proud of a drain. What followed was 6 weeks of the least dramatic and most useful work I have ever done, and I set it down in detail because it is the exact opposite of how these things are told, and it is how they actually get done. I did not go and look at Blackmore. That is the first thing, and it is the thing every story gets wrong. You do not begin a survey by walking onto the site of a man who wants you dead. You begin in the archive because buildings leave paper, and paper does not have guards. The charter house at Aldermere. Caches access my questions. Every substantial work in the empire that touches a watercourse, a road, or a boundary generates a filing, not because anyone cares about architecture, but because it generates a dispute, and disputes generate records that outlive everyone involved. I did not ask for plans of Blackmore. There are none, and asking would have been remembered. I asked, through Highmore's clerk, for the water rights filings on the Blackmore burn for the last 80 years, which is the dullest possible request, and the sort of trading house makes constantly. They were beautiful. In the year my grandfather in this world was young, the Earl's grandfather had been sued by a miller downstream for diverting the burn, and the suit contained, as such suits always do, a sworn statement of exactly what had been built, why and where, in order to prove it was lawful. The old castle had drawn its water from a spring under the north knoll and shed its waste down a stone-vaulted culvert to the burn, and the culvert's outfall was described, with the precision of a man defending himself in court, as below the mill cut at the elbow of the burn beneath the alders. The tax rolls. 2 decades later, Voss's father rebuilt. New curtain, new great hall, the whole West Range added. Rebuilding on that scale is bought with a levy, and a levy is recorded. The rolls told me what was demanded, and when, which told me the sequence of the works, which told me, this is the part that mattered, that the new West Range had gone up across the line of the old North Knoll water supply. They had capped the spring and cut a new well inside the new bailey, which meant the old culvert had been decommissioned at its head, and a decommissioned culvert is not filled in. Filling 140 yards of stone vault costs more than leaving it. You wall off the top end and you forget about it, and the tax roll will show you a small charge for masons and a week's work and no material at all, which is precisely what it showed. And the third source, which nobody thinks of. I asked Kasia to find out where Blackmore's household sent its laundry. She thought I had lost my reason. I had not. A castle of 300 people generates an enormous volume of foul water and waste, and if the old culvert was blocked at the head, all of that had to go somewhere, and it was not going up. The answer came back inside a week. Blackmore's washing was done outside the walls, in a stone laundry house on the burn, and the household's waste went down a newer conduit on the east side into the same burn well below it, because the west and north of the castle had no drainage at all anymore, which is why the West Range had a reputation among servants for being cold, damp, and smelling faintly of a cellar in wet weather. Cold, damp, smelling of a cellar. That is not a rumor. That is a diagnosis. A range with no drainage that smells of a cellar in wet weather is a range sitting on a void that is holding water, and the only void under the West Range of Blackmore was 140 yards of Earl's grandfather's abandoned stone culvert, walled at the head, still open at the outfall, running under the exact wing of the castle where a 9-year-old girl was being kept. Nobody had inspected it in 41 years. Nobody had thought about it in 41 years. It did not appear on any plan because there were no plans, and it did not appear in anyone's memory because the only people who ever knew about it were the masons who capped it, who had been paid a week's wages in a year when the Earl's father was alive. I found the way into Earl Cadman Voss's castle in a water rights lawsuit, a tax roll, and a complaint about damp, without ever going within 30 miles of the place. Gareth, when I laid it all out, sat looking at the drawing for a long time. He had been a soldier for 40 years, and had stormed 2 castles and besieged a third. In 40 years, he said slowly, I have watched good men die on ladders under a wall that was built to kill them. Every one of those sieges, some lord looked at that wall and asked how we'd get over it. Not once, not one time, my lord, did anybody in the tent ask where the castle pissed. Because it's beneath a lord's notice, which is exactly why it's still open. I tapped the outfall. Everything I've ever been given in this world I got because somebody important couldn't be bothered to look at something. The salt was a curse until I looked at it. Bram was a drunk until I looked at him. Sarn was a net mender. I'm not clever, Gareth. I've just noticed that this empire throws away an enormous amount of perfectly good information and then congratulates itself on its walls. The plan had 3 parts and only one of them was mine, which is the correct ratio, and I want to say so plainly. Mine was the way in and the way out. The old culvert, entered at the outfall below the alders at the elbow of the burn at night at low water. 140 yards of stone vault, capped at the head, but capped by masons in a week, which means a single skin blocking wall of dressed stone with no buttress and no bond into the vault, because that is what a weak and no materials buys. A blocking wall like that can be taken down quietly from the inside of the vault in about 2 hours by 2 men who know which stone to start with, and it can be reset behind them in 1. And the head of the culvert had originally served the old kitchens, which the tax roll put under the north end of what was now the West Range, a fact I could not confirm and had to accept as a risk, and I said so aloud to everyone twice, because the fastest way to get people killed is to let them think an unverified assumption is a fact. Kasia's was the reason to be there at all, and it was the far cleverer piece of work. We did not sneak into Blackmore. We were invited, because the countess widow of a minor house 2 valleys east held a midwinter feast every year to which every family of standing on the march sent someone, and Blackmore's household provided the wine, and the wine came up from Blackmore's cellars by cart 3 days beforehand with a party of servants, and Highmore had for 11 years sent its own steward's people to help with the setting out, because that is what neighboring houses do, and nobody has thought about it in a decade. 4 extra Highmore servants in that party would be noticed by precisely nobody. Kasha would be at the feast itself, in the front of the house, being Lady Varen very loudly in front of a great many witnesses, at the exact hours we were under the West Range. And Gareth's was the honest assessment of what could not be done, which is the most valuable contribution any soldier ever makes. He killed 2 versions of the plan outright. He refused to let me take more than 4 men into the vault. 4 can be hidden, 6 cannot, and the 6th man is the one who coughs. And he told me, flatly and in front of everyone, the thing I needed to hear most. You're going in yourself. I know you are, and I'll not waste breath arguing because the girl won't come out of a hole in the ground for a stranger, and there's no one else who can read that stonework in the dark. He fixed me with a look. So understand me. If it goes wrong down there, you are not a lord anymore. You are a man in a drain, and your fire will not help you. The moment you kindle in a stone vault, you are a lantern in a tube telling 300 men exactly where you are. You go in as a thief, my lord. You come out as a thief. If your hand so much as itches toward that silver, we have already lost. He was right, and it went into the plan as a rule, and I want to note what a strange and useful thing that is. The single most dangerous asset I owned was formally excluded from the operation by my own captain, and I agreed with him, because the operation's whole design was not being detected, and a light in a dark place is the opposite of that. We drilled it for 9 days in a trench Bram cut for us on the flats, 140 yards of open trench roofed over with capping slabs, blacked out, cold, wet, to the exact section dimensions from the water rights filing. 3 feet wide, 4 feet 6 at the crown. Small. Small enough that a big man moves on hands and knees for a quarter of an hour at a stretch. We drilled it until the 4 of us could do the whole length in the dark without speaking, using a knot line to count distance, and until Call could take a blocking course apart by feel, and until Hugh, who insisted and who had every right to insist, and whose hands shook for the first 3 days, could keep his breathing quiet for the whole traverse. Because Hugh was coming. Gareth argued. I overruled him, and it was not sentiment. A frightened 9-year-old who has been 8 months in an earl's household will not follow 4 strange men into a hole in the dark for any promise on earth. She will follow her father. He was not a passenger. He was the only part of the extraction that could actually work. 4 of us, then. Myself, Call for the stonework. Tam, because there is no version of my life in which Tam is not standing behind me, and Hugh. The night before we rode, Kasha came to the workroom with the last of the arrangements and found me going over the section drawing for the 9th time, which is a thing I do and which is not, whatever anyone tells you, indecision. She stood there a while. If you are taken under that castle, she said, there is nothing I can do. I want to say that out loud once so that neither of us pretends afterward that there was a plan for it. Highmore cannot acknowledge you. The Chancery cannot help you. You will simply be a body found in a drain, and Earl Voss will be sorrowful, and in the spring the assessor will come, and there will be no warden of the Ashmarch to stand in front of him. I know. Then explain it to me, properly. She sat down across from me, and there was something almost angry in it. 940 people, an assessment in the spring that will take the march off you legally, a war you are currently losing in rooms you have never seen, and you are going to crawl 140 yards under a Blaze's house, with the entire thing resting on a 41-year-old lawsuit and a servant's rumor about damp for one child who is not yours, whose father betrayed you. She held my eyes. I am not sneering. I want the reasoning. Because if it is sentiment, I will tell you plainly that you cannot afford it, and if it is not sentiment, then I have misjudged something and I would like to know what. It was a fair question, and it deserved the true answer rather than the noble one. Earl Voss took a 9-year-old out of a village to make her father into a knife, I said. That's not cruelty for its own sake. He's not a man who enjoys it. It's a method. It's cheap, it's reliable, and it works on anyone who loves anything, which is everyone. He has been running it for a decade, and it is the actual foundation of his power out here, not the aura, not the coin. The knowledge in every hollow village he owns that he can reach whatever you care about. I put the drawing down. So when a man like that discovers that a child was taken out of the middle of his own house and he cannot say a word about it, cannot report it, cannot revenge it, cannot even admit she was there without confessing why, the method stops working. Not for Hugh. For everyone who hears about it. That is not sentiment, Kasha. That is me taking his best weapon off him at a cost of 4 men and a night. She looked at me for a long moment. You have thought about this a great deal. I've thought about it since the night we caught him with the lantern. I shrugged. And yes, also I promised her father over a grave. Both things are true. I've stopped believing you have to choose which reason is the real one. I find the useful thing and the right thing point the same way more often than cynics expect, provided you're willing to look for the version where they do. Kasha Varen stood and gathered her papers and paused at the door with her back to me. Come back, she said. I have spent 11 years being the cleverest person in a house that had no use for it, and I have been here 19 days, and I would take it very badly to have to go back to that. And she left before I could answer, which was, I would learn, entirely characteristic. We rode for Blackmore the next morning, in a wine cart party, in Highmore grey and green, with a knot line and 3 crowbars and 140 yards of somebody's grandfather's forgotten drain between me and a 9-year-old girl. The outfall was exactly where a man had sworn it was in a lawsuit 41 years ago, beneath the alders, at the elbow of the burn, below the mill cut, and I have rarely in my life been so glad of another man's litigiousness. We went in at the black of the night, in the 3rd hour, at low water, which mattered, because the burn was 3 feet up the arch and the crown of the vault was barely above it, and an hour either side we would have been swimming rather than crawling. The mouth was choked with 2 generations of alder root and silt, and the particular black slime that grows where old stone meets running water, and it took us 40 minutes of very quiet work with a saw and our hands to open a gap a man could get through. And the whole time I lay in the freezing burn thinking about the fact that if the vault had collapsed anywhere in the intervening 4 decades, we would find out about it 100 yards in with no room to turn around. That is the part nobody tells you about the clever plan. The clever plan is not a feeling of triumph. It is a series of assumptions you have made in a warm room, being tested one at a time, in the cold, in the dark, with your friends behind you. The vault held. That was the first assumption, and the stone was better than I had any right to expect good grey ashlar, laid by men who were being watched, because it had been built when it was still the Earl's own water and nobody skimps on their own cistern. It was 3 feet wide and 4.5 at the crown, exactly as sworn, and we went up it on hands and knees in 8 inches of black water with a knot line paying out behind Call's belt to count the distance. I will not pretend it was anything but appalling. It was appalling. The cold came up through the wrists and into the chest and stayed there. The air went stale and thick within the first 50 yards and stank of 40 years of standing water. And the roof was low enough that you moved with your back scraping the capping and your face 6 inches above the surface, so that every 3rd or 4th breath you took in the smell of it. Twice, we came to falls of silt that had to be dug out by hand and pushed back past our own bodies. Once, and this is the moment I still dream about, Tam's shoulder brushed a Springer stone that shifted a 1/4 inch with a grinding noise that in that tube sounded like the end of the world, and the 4 of us lay absolutely still in the water for 100 count, and nothing came and we went on. 61 knots, 84, 109. At 131 knots, Call's hand came back down the line and touched my wrist twice, which was the signal we had drilled for stop. The way is closed, and I came up beside him and put my hands on the blocking wall. And I felt it, and I understood in about 4 seconds that I had been entirely right and slightly wrong, and that the slightly wrong part was going to cost us an hour we did not have. Right, it was a single skin of dressed stone, no buttress, no bond into the vault, laid across the culvert head in a week by men with no materials. Exactly the cheap cap the tax roll had bought. Wrong. They had not laid it dry. Somebody, 41 years ago, had had lime mortar left over from the great work above and had used it up here rather than carry it back. And the joints were full, and a mortared wall does not come apart quietly the way a dry one does. Here is where I want to be exact, because this is the difference between an engineer and a man with a crowbar, and it is the whole reason I was in that drain personally rather than sending better men than me. A mortared blocking wall is not one problem. It is 140 little ones, and if you attack it in the middle you will be levering against the whole mass, and it will go all at once with a noise you cannot survive. You do not attack the wall. You attack the joint, and specifically you attack the joint at the springing, at the very edge where the blocking meets the old vault, because that is where two different works meet, and mortar never bonds properly to a 40-year-old surface it was not laid against. It is the weakest line in any patch on any building anywhere, and it is invisible unless you have spent your life looking at where new work meets old. I put Call's hand on it in the dark and he understood at once, because Call is a craftsman and craftsmen do not need to be told twice about a bad joint. It took us 2 hours and 11 minutes to take out 9 stones, working with a rag wrapped round the bar to kill the ring of steel on stone. One man's hands catching the mortar dust so it did not splash, taking each stone back along the line hand to be laid in the water rather than dropped. 2 hours in 8 inches of water at the far end of 140 yards of drain, listening to feet crossing a flagged floor somewhere above us, at one point close enough that we stopped for the length of 100 count, while somebody in the room over our heads had a long and boring conversation about a horse. And then the 9th stone came out, and there was air on my face, warmer air, dry air, air with wood smoke and cooking fat in it, and a hole into the underfloor of the west range of Blackmore. The old kitchens. The tax roll had been right, and I had told everyone twice that I could not confirm it, and it had been right. We came up into a store cellar under the west range through a flagstone that had been laid over the old culvert head and never mortared down, because why would you mortar down a flag over a drain nobody remembers? The cellar was full of the enormous banal debris of a great house, barrels, broken furniture, a bale of mildewed hangings, 40 years of things too good to burn and not good enough to use. It smelled, exactly as the laundry rumor had promised, of damp and cellar and cold. Above us, through the boards, I could hear the house, the deep, unmistakable, multi-layered sound of 300 people asleep in one building, which is not silence at all, and which is the safest sound in the world to move under. Now, and this is the part of the operation that was not mine, and that I had lain awake about, we did not know which room. Cash's information was 5 months old and second-hand. A girl in the West Range, kept among the servants but watched in the West Range, which is 50 rooms. We had no map, no informer inside, and no way to search a wing of a sleeping castle without waking it. The plan I had drawn had a blank space here, and I had written on the drawing in my own hand, "Solve on sight," which is the honest way of admitting that a plan has a hole in it. Hugh solved it in 90 seconds, and it was the single best decision anybody made that night, and it came from a place I could not have reached. "Servants stare," he breathed. "My lord, a household this size, the little ones sleep near the kitchen fire always, every great house, because it's the one place that's warm all night and the cook wants hands at 4th hour for the bread. If they've put her with the servants, they've put her where the small ones sleep, and the small ones sleep by the ovens. It's not 50 rooms. It's 1 room, and it's above the bakehouse, and the bakehouse has to be." He turned, orienting on the smell of old fat, and pointed at the cellar's north wall. "There, because that's where the flue comes down. I have been given a great many gifts by the people I have gathered. That one was among the largest, and it did not come from a system in my head. It came from a man who had spent his whole life in the servants' half of the world, being invisible in exactly the way that teaches you where everybody sleeps. We went up the service stair with our boots off. I will not stretch this out, because at the time it did not feel long, it felt like about 4 heartbeats. Second landing, a passage smelling of yeast and ash, a low door, and behind the low door a long warm room over the bakehouse with 11 pallets in it, and 11 sleeping children and young servants, the oven's brick wall giving off the day's heat through the floor, and one small shape at the far end under the window that Hugh found in the dark from the doorway without a moment's hesitation, because he was her father. And then it went wrong, exactly as Gareth had said it would, and exactly not in the place any of us had drilled. Because Hugh reached his daughter and put his hand over her mouth to wake her quietly, the way we had rehearsed 40 times, and Alin, who had spent 8 months as a hostage in a strange house learning what men's hands in the dark meant, did what any child in that position would do. She bit him and she screamed. It was not a loud scream. It was cut off in about a half-second when she got her eyes open and understood who was holding her. But it was a scream in a room with 11 sleepers in it, and one of the 11 sat straight up out of sleep 3 pallets away. A woman of perhaps 50, gray-haired, in a servant's shift, with the instant total wakefulness of someone who has been woken in the night many times and never once for a good reason. She saw 4 filthy men, stinking of drain water in her sleeping room, one of them with his hand on a child. And that was the whole operation, right there. That was 6 weeks of archives and lawsuits and drains and drilling, ended by a frightened 9-year-old doing the sanest thing she had ever done in her life, and there was nothing left to do about it except the 2 things men usually do in that moment, which are to kill the witness or to run. I want to record that Call's hand went to his knife. He is not a bad man. He was very frightened, and there were 4 of us and 900 people at home who would pay for it. I put my hand flat on his forearm and pushed it down, and I stepped past him into the middle of the room where the woman could see all of me, and I opened both my hands, and I did the only thing I have ever really been able to do, which is not violence and is not charm. I told a stranger the truth and offered her the thing that nobody in her life had bothered to offer her. That child was taken out of a village at Marrow's Ford 8 months ago to make her father do a thing he did not want to do, I said quietly in the dark with my hands open. That man behind me is her father. His name is Hugh. He has not seen her since. Nobody in this house has done her a violence, and I am not accusing you of one, but you know exactly what she is, mistress, because you have been in this household long enough to know what the Earl keeps children for. I did not move. You can scream. If you scream, they will take us, and they will take him, and she will stay in this house until she is old enough to be useful in some other way. Or you can lie back down and be asleep, and in the morning you will know nothing at all, and one child will be gone out of a place she was never meant to be. The room was extremely quiet. Somewhere below, the house creaked. I could hear Tam breathing behind me and Hugh not breathing at all. The woman looked at me for a long, long moment. Then she looked at Alin, sitting up now with her father's arms round her and her face against his shoulder. And then she said, in a flat whisper that I have thought about more often than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. They took my son for the levee in the spring and he's a year dead and they never sent word. I found out from a carter. She lay back down and turned her face to the wall. Go out by the north stair, not the way you came up. The night porter sits at the foot of the west one and he doesn't sleep. And take her shoes, there under the pallet, and she'll not get a mile barefoot. That is Earl Cadman Voss's security. Not the walls, not the blaze. 300 people under his roof, every one of whom he has taught personally over a decade that he will take whatever they love if it is convenient, and not one of whom will lift a finger for him at the moment it costs them nothing to look the other way. He built his whole power on the method, and the method is why a stranger in a night shift told me which stair the porter sat on. We went out by the north stair. We took the shoes. The traverse back down the culvert with a 9-year-old was the worst hour of the whole enterprise, and it very nearly broke on the thing I had least considered, which was not the stone or the water or the guards, but the simple fact that 140 yards of black pipe 4.5 feet high is an unbearable thing for a child to be asked to enter, and no amount of engineering addresses that. Alin got 9 feet in and stopped and locked rigid, and would not go forward and could not be pulled, and began to make a thin high sound in her throat that in that stone tube would carry, and we were 4 men and a terrified child under a sleeping castle with the blocking wall open behind us and dawn perhaps 2 hours off. Hugh could not reach her. He was behind her, and it made it worse. I came back down past him, which meant climbing over another man in a 3-foot pipe, and I will not describe it, until I was in front of her in the water with my face a foot from hers in absolute darkness. And I did not tell her it would be all right, because she would have known that was a lie, and children who have been hostages have a very good ear for adults lying to make themselves comfortable. "Elin, my name is Aldric. I built a thing like this once, a stone road for water, 11 miles of it, and I walked every yard. I kept my voice absolutely level, which was not easy. This one is 140 yards. I have measured it. I know exactly how long it is and exactly what is at the other end, and there is nothing else in here but us and the water. You do not have to be brave, and you do not have to be quiet. You only have to do a thing 140 times, and the thing is, put your hand forward and find the next knot in the rope. That's all it is. 1 knot, then the next one. Your father is right behind you the whole way, and I am right here in front, and neither of us is going anywhere. Find me the first knot." It took her about 20 seconds. Then a very small, cold hand came forward in the dark and touched the line and found the knot, and I said, "That's one." And we went 140 yards of that, knot by knot, me counting each one out loud in a whisper, for the better part of an hour, in 8 inches of freezing water. I have commanded a wall against an earl's steel. Nothing has ever taken as much out of me as counting to 140 for a 9-year-old. Call reset the 9 stones behind us. That was the plan, and he did it, in the dark, in 25 minutes, packing the joints with silt off the vault floor so a torch held to it would show nothing but old, dirty stone. It mattered more than anything else we did that night. Because when Blackmore woke and found a ward missing, the Earl would tear his household apart looking for the betrayal, and he would find no forced door, no cut bar, no rope, no mark on any wall, nothing at all except a child gone out of a locked house in the middle of the night. And the one thing he would never find, because it did not exist on any plan of his castle, in any memory in his household, or in any thought that had ever crossed his mind, was a drain. We came out under the alders in the last of the dark. The winecart party rolled home from the feast that afternoon in Highmore Grey and Green with 4 servants and 1 extra small, one asleep under the empty barrels, and Lady Cassia Varon, who had spent the entire night being extremely visible in a great hall 40 miles from a drain, rode back separately 2 days later. Hugh did not let go of his daughter for 3 days. Not once he carried her asleep. He ate one-handed. He sat outside while Myra washed her and fed her and put her in clean clothes, and then went away and cried where nobody could see, which Myra has never admitted to, and which Kessa reported to me with great solemnity. And on the 4th day, Osric came to me with his tablets and his driest face, and said the thing that turned the whole night from a rescue into a weapon. "My lord, I have had 4 separate reports in 3 days from 3 different directions, and they all say the same thing, and none of them come from us." He set the tablet down. "The story is running in the hollow villages, not our story, theirs. They are saying that the Earl of Blackmore kept a child of Marrow's Ford in his own house to make her father a knife, and that somebody walked into Blackmore in the night and took her back out of it, and that the Earl cannot say one word about it, because to hunt for her he must first explain to the Crown why he had her." A pause. "There is a woman at Blackmore telling that story in the kitchen, my lord, and it is going out of that castle a little further every day, on every cart, in every laundry basket. And there is nothing whatsoever he can do to stop it." That was the moment I understood what we had actually done under the West Range. I had gone into that drain for one child, and a promise made over a grave. What came out of it was the end of the only thing that had ever really held Earl Cadman Voss's frontier together, the certainty, in every starving village he owned, that whatever you loved, he could reach it and you could not. He could reach it, but it turned out that somebody could reach back. And in the spring, a crown assessor was going to ride onto that frontier and ask the people of the Ashmarch and the people of Blackmoor what kind of lords they had. Earl Voss could not accuse me of taking the child. So he hit the one thing he could reach without ever mentioning her, and he did it inside 9 days, and it cost me more than the drain had. He bought the road. Not Harrow's bridge. Harrow was finished as a power the day the water road opened, and had spent the winter being quietly ruined by his own irrelevance. The coast track, the 40 miles of open ground between Saltmouth and the southern markets, the overland leg that every cart of Duncairn salt had to travel after it came down the Greywater. Voss did not blockade it. Blockading is an act, and acts can be reported to a justiciar. Instead, the Earl of Blackmoor did something entirely lawful and completely devastating. He offered every carrier, factor, and coasting captain working that shore a standing contract at a rate no honest hauler could refuse, and the contracts carried an exclusivity clause. Take Blackmoor's grain at Blackmoor's excellent price all year guaranteed, or take the Ashmarch salt. Not both. That is all. No threat, no unmarked steal, nothing anyone could take to a court. Just a rich man spending money to make it irrational for anybody to trade with me. It worked in 11 days. Captain Maeve held out longest and came to the quay herself to tell me she was done, and she was so angry she could barely get the words out. I've run cargo out of ports that were on fire, Warden. I'm not frightened of your Earl. She slapped the contract down on the boards. But he's offering 3 years guaranteed at a fifth over the market to every hull on this coast, and if I turn it down my crew go to a captain who took it, and my ship goes to the bank. And there's no salt of yours to run anyway because there'll be no carter on that track to bring it down. He hasn't beaten you. He's bought the water round you and left you sitting in it. She jabbed a finger at me. And I'll tell you the worst of it because you'd better hear it from someone who likes you. It's costing him a fortune. He is losing coin on every one of those contracts. He can do that for 3 years and not feel it, and you cannot survive one. By the end of the month, Duncairn had a chartered market, 9 fountains, a wall, 400 trained men, 1,200 people, and no buyers. The pans went on producing beautiful clean salt at a rate we had spent a year building up to, and it went into sacks, and the sacks went into the new warehouse, and the warehouse filled, and then the overflow went under tarpaulin along the quay, and the treasury did not move at all. I want to be honest about the shape of that winter, because it was the first time since I woke up on the salt that I could not see the answer. I tried 5 things. 2 were sound and failed anyway. 3 were desperate, and I knew it while I was doing them. We tried selling direct to the little coastal ports ourselves in our own bottoms, and discovered that Sarnes reed rafts, which were miracles on a river, are death on open sea. And we lost 1 and nearly lost 4 men, and I stopped that immediately and took the blame for it in front of the whole town, because it had been my idea, and it had been a bad one. And the correct thing to do with a bad idea is to kill it in public before it kills somebody. We tried barter inland, and found Voss had got there first with the same contracts. We tried to break the exclusivity clause with Osric's lawyering, and Osric, who by now had a genuine artist's contempt for Blackmoor's chancery man, came back gray-faced, and said the clauses were beautifully drafted and entirely lawful, and he could not touch them. And through all of it the arithmetic ground on, because 1,200 people eat every single day whether or not there is a market. The grain we had bought forward against salt came in and went out again into mouths. The treasury emptied. By the turn of the year I was paying the works in food rather than coin, and by the month after that I had stopped the works entirely except the ones that produced something edible. And the town, which had spent a year getting used to a lord who could always find a way, began to have the particular quiet that comes when people are frightened and are being careful not to say so in front of you. Myra put it to me straight in the middle of it, because that is what she is for. They're not angry with you. I want you to know that first because you'll assume it. She was building a fire, not looking at me. They're frightened. There's a difference, and you've never been on this side of it. A year ago they'd nothing, so there was nothing to lose. Now there's a wall and water and school for the little ones and a market square, and every one of them has worked out that a man who can build all that can also lose it, and they're lying awake doing the same sums you are. She set the flint down. So no, don't stand up in the square and give them courage. They've got courage. Give them a plan, even a bad one, even one that might not work. People can live on a plan. It's the not knowing that hollows them. She was right, and it was a lesson I have never needed twice. That a leader's job in a bad season is not to be inspiring, it is to be legible. So I stopped protecting them from the situation. I put the whole of it on a board in the market square, the contracts, the warehouse tonnage, the grain remaining, the days, and I updated it every week in my own hand, including the weeks it got worse, and I told them plainly that I did not yet have the answer and that I was working, and that they would know what I knew when I knew it. They took it far better than any comfortable lie. Myra was right about that too. And it was in the middle of that grinding, unglamorous, unwinnable winter, with the salt piling up unsold and the town going quiet and me having, for the first time, genuinely no idea what to do, that Kessa came in off the West Flats at a dead run for the third time in her life. It's moved. She was gray and shaking, and she had ridden a horse half to death, which Kessa has never done for anything. The gray, Aldric the deep gray, the wrong country, the edge of it. I marked the edge myself last autumn. I cut the mark into the standing stone at Corey's fault, same as you taught me. I've walked it every month. She got her breath. It's 4 miles closer, 4 miles since the autumn. It's coming, and it's coming fast, and the west spring, the spring, Aldric, our spring, the one the water comes from. She stopped, and I have never seen her frightened like that before or since. It's 1.5 miles from the edge. I have had a number of bad moments. That was among the worst, because it was the first time the whole architecture of what I had built was threatened by something that could not be negotiated with, outthought, or sued. I rode out at once with Gareth and Kessa and 4 of Rogan's old spearmen, and I took the survey staffs, because if I was going to look at the end of the world, I was going to measure it, and I have never yet found a situation improved by not knowing the numbers. Kessa's marks were exact. She had cut them into standing stones at half-mile intervals along the old edge the previous autumn, precisely as I had taught her, dated by notch, and the gray had crossed them. Not in a straight line, it moved like a stain in cloth, faster in the low ground, slower on the rises, with long gray tongues probing ahead down the shallow drainage lines. In one place it had come nearly 6 miles. In another, barely 1. I spent 2 days surveying the front of it, and I want to describe what that country is like now that I had time to look at it properly, because the words blight and gray tide are too clean. It is not burned, and it is not desert. It is wrong. The salt goes the color of an old bruise and then the color of ash, and it loses the crystalline glitter that healthy flats have. It goes soft and flowery and takes a bootprint like grave dirt. Nothing grows, but more than that, nothing has died properly either. The scrub at the edge stands where it grew, gray and intact and light as pumice, holding its shape until you touch it and it collapses into dust. There are no bones. That is the detail that stayed with me. In any dead country there are bones. In the gray there is nothing at all, as though the whole substance of living things has been taken out and only the shape left standing, and the shape is waiting for you to lean on it. And the air over it is thin. Not thin like a mountain, thin like a room where something is drawing. I mapped the front over 11 miles, and I plotted the advance against Kessa's dated marks, and the numbers were as bad as numbers get. Between the previous autumn and that day, it had advanced an average of 3 miles and a fraction, with a maximum of 5 3/4 in about 5 months. It was not slowing. Comparing Kessa's older marks to the ones before, it was not even constant. It was accelerating. I sat on a rock at the edge of the gray with a wax tablet doing the only arithmetic that mattered, and I got the answer, and then checked it 3 times because I did not want it. At the current rate, the gray reached the West Spring in perhaps 14 months. It reached the head of the aqueduct in about 20. It reached the wall of Duncairn in under 3 years. 3 years. I had built a town to last 4 centuries, and the ground under it had 34 months. And the second thing, the thing I did not say aloud to anyone on that flat, and sat with for the whole ride home, was that the front of the gray did not run north-south, as it would if it were simply spreading in a circle out of the deep west. It ran northeast. The great tongue of it was not aimed at me at all. It was aimed straight up the good country, toward the fat fields and the deep soil and the hollow villages and the swollen gray castle on its hill. The gray tide was going to eat Blackmore first. We were 9 miles out on the way home when the thing came out of the gray after us, and I learned 2 things in about 90 seconds. What my fire could actually do when I stopped being afraid of it, and what it costs. It came at dusk and it came fast, which the first one had not. That one had walked, slow and inevitable, killing the ground it crossed. This was a different shape and a worse one. Lower, longer, running with a horrible loose four-limbed gait like something remembering how a wolf moves, salt-crusted, wrong-jointed, with the same blank-crusted mask where a face should be. And there were 3 of them. Gareth had us into a wedge before I had finished turning my horse, which is what 40 years buys you, and the 4 spearmen held, and I will name them here because they deserve it. Alder, Coop, young Fen, and the one everyone called Ox. They had drilled all winter on a wall against men, and they set their spears against something out of the gray and did not run, and 2 of them lived. Steel did what steel had done on the West Flat. It went in and came out blackened and pitted and half-eaten, and the wound closed like wet clay. Gareth's ember bit deeper. His aura is a real and terrible thing, and it made them flinch. But he is one man and there were 3, and I watched him take a blow across the shoulder that would have killed anything without aura and go down on one knee with his plate crumpled in like a stepped-on cup. And I kindled. Not the way I had on the West Flat, which had been need and terror and the seal tearing open. 6 months of Gareth's dawn drills had put something in me by then that I did not have before. And when I reached for the silver this time, I did it the way you open a valve rather than the way you break a dam. Slow, controlled, taking exactly as much as I could hold. And then, when that was not enough, deliberately taking more, knowing what it would cost, which is a different and much colder kind of courage than not knowing. The silver came up my arm and along the blade, and this time it did not stop at the blade. It went a foot beyond the steel, a long, cold, blade-shaped tongue of silver-white light, and when I cut a thing 3 feet away from where my sword actually was. I have thought a great deal about what happened next, and the honest summary is, I killed one, I crippled one, and I have very little memory of the middle of it. The blight things did not merely flinch from the silver as the first one had. They broke. Where the light touched them, the gray substance did not cut so much as unmake, went to powder, sheeted away, the wrongness in them coming apart like a knot pulled by the right end. The third one turned and ran, which nothing out of the gray had ever done in front of anyone, and I stood in the ash-colored dusk with a silver blade 3 feet longer than my sword and understood, with total clarity, that whatever the Dominion had sealed inside a discarded Vale sun was not a martial gift at all. It was a counter. Somebody or something had made a thing whose entire purpose was to undo the gray, and it had been sitting locked in the chest of a boy his family threw away on the exact frontier the gray was coming to. Then the cost arrived. The backlash was not like the first time. It did not throw me down. It came slower and it went deeper, and it kept coming for 2 days. My sword arm useless to the shoulder, both hands shaking so badly I could not hold a cup, a nosebleed that would not stop for 6 hours, and a cold in the bones of my chest that felt precisely like the thin drawing air over the gray, as if in using the thing I had briefly let a little of the other country in. Bram found me on the 3rd morning trying to hold a stylus and failing, and said nothing, and went and got Kasha. She looked at my hands for a while. "How many more times can you do that?" "I don't know. That's the honest answer. 30. I got the stylus into my left hand instead. It's the only weapon anyone has ever had against them, so the number matters rather a lot, and I have no way to find it out except by using it, and every time I use it I spend some of it. Then hear the political version of that, because you will not like it and you need it." She sat down opposite. "You are, as far as anyone alive knows, the only weapon that exists against the thing that is coming. That is not a gift, Aldric. That is the most dangerous position a man can occupy, because the moment the Empire learns it, You stop being a person and become an asset. And assets are owned, moved, spent, and if they cannot be owned, destroyed by the people who cannot have them. Her eyes did not move off mine. Earl Voss would rather you were dead than useful to a crown he does not control. So would half the great houses. You have perhaps one season to decide who finds out and in what order, and after that it will be decided for you. And there, in a cold workroom, with a shaking hand and a nosebleed and 1,200 unsold sacks of salt in a warehouse, was the actual shape of the spring. The gray tide was coming, and it was coming for Blackmore first, and I was the only thing in the empire it feared. And in 8 weeks a crown assessor was going to ride onto this frontier to value my town for a tribute designed to break me. I stopped seeing 3 problems that afternoon. I started seeing one. The Dominion, when it steadied that night, showed me the ladder had moved under me. Aura sparked to ember, reached beyond the blade, cost severe. The gray does not flinch now, it breaks. Ember, Gareth's rank. The rank of a knight of real name, and I had come to it in a year and a half from Hollow. From the boy the whole march laughed at, and I did not feel one moment of triumph about it, because I had just been told by the only person who would tell me the truth that being the only sword against the dark is not a promotion. It is a target painted on a man in a color every great house in the empire can see. I spent 4 days after that doing nothing anybody could see, which Myra told me later was the single most alarming thing I did all winter, and which was in fact the most productive work of the entire year. I sat with a board and I put the 3 disasters on it. The market Voss had bought out from under me, the assessment coming in the spring, and the gray tide eating the frontier. And I did the thing my whole profession is actually for, which is not solving problems. Any competent man can solve a problem. The trade is in recognizing that 2 problems are the same problem, because that is where the leverage is, and it is nearly always invisible until somebody sits down and refuses to be busy for a while. And on the 4th day I found it, and when I found it I laughed out loud alone in a cold room for the first time in 3 months, because the crown assessor was not coming to value Duncairn. That was what Voss had arranged and what everyone, including me, had accepted as the frame. The assessor was coming to reset the tribute schedule of the Ashmarch March, and a march is not a town. A march is a region. Corvin Ask of the Chancery was riding out here with the authority and the obligation to value the whole frontier, its land under yield, its trade, its improvement, including the parts of it that belonged to the Earl of Blackmore. And the Earl of Blackmore had spent a decade keeping his villages deliberately hollow, yielding nothing, valued at nothing, because a hollow village pays no tribute to a crown. That was the whole rotten genius of him. That was what Cassia had shown me in the valuation table. The empire taxed my competence and subsidized his cruelty. But there is a second reading of that same table, and Voss had never had to worry about it before, because for 10 years nobody with any authority had ever come out here to look. A lord whose lands yield nothing pays nothing, and a lord whose lands yield nothing because he has concealed from the crown that they are being destroyed by something advancing 3 miles a year toward the heart of the empire is not merely a bad landlord. He is committing a fraud on the crown. And he is doing it about the most dangerous fact in the world. I sent for Cassia and Osric and Kessa, and I put the survey of the gray front on the table next to the Chancery valuation schedule, and I said the sentence that turned that whole ruinous winter over on its back. We stopped trying to make my valuation smaller. We can't, and it's a trap, and every hour we spend arguing it is an hour on his ground. I put my finger on the great northeastern tongue of the gray, aimed like a spear at Blackmore's fat fields. We make sure Corvin Ask values the whole march honestly, all of it, every acre, including his. I looked up. Kessa, how long to survey the gray front properly? Dated marks, measured advance, mapped, in a form a Chancery man cannot argue with. With 4 of us in the staffs, 6 weeks, 5 if the weather holds. You have 8, and you have every horse I own. I turned to Osric. And you are going to write the dullest, most correct, most exhaustively courteous document of your entire career, and it is going to be a loyal Warden survey of his march, submitted in advance to the Chancery so the assessor has it in hand before he ever meets the Earl of Blackmore. Osric's dry face did something I had only seen twice. You are not going to accuse him of anything, again. I'm not going to mention him at all, I said. I'm going to send the Crown a map. Corvin Ask of the Chancery arrived on the 9th of the spring with 2 clerks, a mule of ledgers, and the settled, incurious expression of a man who has valued 300 estates and expects to be lied to by every single person he meets for the next 6 weeks. He was perhaps 50, small, neat, entirely gray, with ink on the side of his hand, and a way of not answering things. He had been lodged and fed and guided for 4 days by the Earl of Blackmore before he ever set foot in the Ashmarch, exactly as Cassia had predicted, and he arrived at Duncairn's gate having been shown, I would learn much later, a very careful tour indeed, the Earl's own well-run home farm, 2 prosperous villages near the castle that Voss maintained precisely for this purpose, and a great deal of courteous conversation about the ambition of the young Vale on the western march. He also arrived, because Osric had sent it to the Chancery 6 weeks before by 3 separate hands, with a copy of the survey of the Ashmarch, submitted in duty by Aldric Vale, Warden, in his baggage. I had thought very hard about how to receive him, and in the end I did the only thing I have ever been any good at, which is to not perform at all. There was no honor guard. I did not put the militia on the wall, and I did not have the town cleaned up, and I did not meet him in anything but my working clothes with the morning's dust on them, because a frontier warden who stages a spectacle for a Chancery assessor is a man with something to hide, and every assessor alive knows it. I met him at the gate with Osric and Myra, and I said the following, which I had not rehearsed and did not need to. Master Ask, you'll want the ledgers, the tally of souls, the pan yields, the trade book, and the works accounts, and they're laid out in the hall, including the 4 months where the accounts are bad, which you want to see most and which I have not tidied. My steward is at your disposal for the whole of your stay, and I have instructed him to answer anything you ask, without consulting me first. I stepped aside. You may walk anywhere in this town without me, speak to anyone in it without me, and if you would prefer that I am not present at all while you do it, say so, and I'll keep out of your way. Nobody here has been told what to say to you. He looked at me for a moment, with the first flicker of actual attention I had got out of him. Nobody has been told what to say to me, he repeated. No. Warden, I have been doing this for 22 years. In 22 years, every household I have ever entered has been told what to say to me. He handed his cloak to a clerk. It is invariably obvious within the hour, and it invariably means the true accounts are elsewhere. I shall begin with your bad 4 months. He stayed 11 days. I want to record what he actually did because it was not what Voss expected, and it was not quite what I had expected either. He did not spend his time with me. He spent it with everybody else. He walked the aqueduct, the whole 11¼ miles of it, on foot over 2 days with Bram, asking questions about frost lines and bedding that Bram answered with enormous and slightly aggressive pride. He sat in the market and counted carts. He went through Osric's books for 3 days with a thoroughness that made even Osric nervous, and found 2 errors, both of them ours, both of them small, both of them against our own interest, which I would not have known how to arrange if I had tried. He talked to Myra for a whole afternoon. He talked to Call. He asked the schoolmaster. We had a schoolmaster by then, a defrocked clerk from one of Voss's villages, teaching 40 children their letters in the back of the market hall, how many of his pupils' parents could read, and got the answer none, sir, not one, and wrote it down. And on the 6th day I found him standing at one of the 9 fountains for a long time, watching the water run and overflow into the trough and away down the drainage ditch, all day, all night, for nothing. It doesn't stop, he said when he noticed me. It was almost an accusation. It can't. There's no valve at the fountains. It's a gravity feed off a header tank. It runs continuously by design. Stopping it is harder than letting it run. The waste. It goes down that ditch to the pans and the pans use it. Nothing's wasted, it's just not hoarded. I shrugged. And if it were wasted, I'd still build it that way. A tap is a thing a man can be told he may not use. A fountain that never stops is a thing nobody can be refused. That's not hydraulics, Master Ask. That's the entire point of it. He wrote that down too. I did not know then whether that was good or very bad. Earl Cadman Voss arrived on the 11th day with 40 men to be present for the assessment of the march, which was his right as its ranking lord, and which was the whole architecture of the trap finally closing. He was exactly as I remembered, immaculate, silver-templed, warm, delighted to see me, taking my hand in both of his in front of the entire square as though I were a promising nephew. He admired the fountains. He admired the wall. He asked after my health with what a stranger would have sworn was genuine concern, and he did it all in front of Corvin Ask, and every single warm word was another entry in the inventory. The assessment was held in the market hall, with the doors open, which I insisted on, and which Voss permitted with a graciousness that told me he thought it helped him. Perhaps 200 people stood in the square outside to listen. Ask sat at the table with his clerks and his ledgers and the schedule. Voss did not attack me once. I want that understood because it is what makes him what he is. He praised me for an hour and a half. And one cannot help but be moved, Master Ask, by what the Warden has achieved. I say this as the man who granted him the march, warm, rueful, entirely sincere sounding. A curtain wall of some 600 yards, a standing levy of 400 trained men trained, mark you, not mustered, an independent trade route to the sea, a chartered market, and now this quite extraordinary aqueduct, 11 miles of dressed stone in a single winter. He spread his hands. I confess I hardly know how to advise you. By the schedule, permanent improvement is valued at a multiple, and I have never in my life seen improvement on this scale in a frontier march. One does not wish to punish industry, but the Crown's schedule is the Crown's schedule, and the Ashmarch is plainly no longer the barren waste it was set at. Its due must reflect what it has become. It was flawless. He had just in the most affectionate possible language valued my town at a figure that would take every copper the salt could earn in a year I could no longer sell salt in, and he had done it as a compliment in public, without a single word that any court in the empire could call malice. Ask made a note. Then he said, without looking up, "My Lord Earl, before I set the Ashmarch schedule, I must complete the valuation of the march as a whole. That includes the eastern portion, your own holdings under the march's charter." He turned a page. "I have the Warden's submitted survey. I should like to reconcile it against your returns of the last 4 years." And there, for about a quarter of a second, and I do not think anyone else in that hall caught it, I watched Earl Cadman Voss's face do nothing at all in a way that was very slightly wrong. Of course, though I should say my eastern lands are poor country and always have been, thin soil, the returns are modest and have been modest since my father's time. Yes, that is the reconciliation I should like to make. He laid out Kessa's map on the table, 6 weeks of surveying, dated marks, measured advances, 11 miles of front plotted and cross-checked in Osric's beautiful chancery hand. Because the Warden's survey records that some 410 square miles of the Eastern March, that is to say, the majority of the lands returned by your lordship as poor country, thin soil, are not poor country at all. They are dead, blighted, sterile. And the survey states, with dated evidence at half-mile intervals, that the condition is not static. He looked up for the first time. It is advancing northeast at a rate of between 3 and 5 miles a year, toward your seat, my lord, and toward the interior. The hall went absolutely silent. I did not say one word. That was the whole design, and it was the hardest thing I did in the entire episode of my life. I sat there with my hands on the table, and I let a chancery man read a map. I never accused Earl Voss of anything. I have never, to this day, accused Earl Voss of anything. I submitted a dutiful survey of my own march, in duty, as a loyal warden, 6 weeks in advance, and I let an honest man with 22 years of valuations do the only thing an honest man can do when he is handed 2 documents that cannot both be true. The frontier has always had bad ground, Master asked. The salt flats to the west are barren. It is the nature of a march. Still perfectly warm, still perfectly steady. The warden is young, and this country has a great many old wives' tales in it. It may be so. I am not competent to judge a blight. A pause, and then the sentence that ended the assessment of the Ashmarch, and though nobody in that hall knew it, began everything that came after. But I am extremely competent to judge a return, and my difficulty, my lord, is this. If the Eastern March is poor country of thin soil, as your returns have stated these 14 years, then it should have yielded a small but stable revenue, and it has. And if it is 400 square miles of advancing sterility, then it has been failing progressively for at least a decade, and your returns should have declined and reported the cause, because a Crown tenant is required to report material degradation of Crown-chartered land within the year he becomes aware of it. He tapped the ledger. Your returns are stable, my lord. Suspiciously, beautifully stable. Which means either the warden's survey is a fabrication, and it is dated, marked, and physically verifiable by me, on foot, at half-mile intervals, this week. Or the Earl of Blackmore has known for a decade that a large part of the Crown's frontier is dying, and has not told the Crown. He did not break. I want to set that down, because there is a version of this that ends with the villain's mask falling off, and it did not happen, and it was far more frightening that it did not. Earl Cadman Voss took the accusation of a decade's fraud against the Crown, in public, in a market hall, in front of 200 of my people, and he considered it, with his head slightly tilted, like a man being told about a discrepancy in a wine order. And then he answered it, well, immediately and at least half convincingly, that the degradation was a recent thing, that it had been reported informally, that the frontier's old playground had waxed and waned for centuries, that no responsible lord alarms a chancery over a bad season. He was fluent and he was reasonable, and he very nearly carried it. And if he had been dealing with anything except a dated, measured, physical survey, he would have. But Ask could walk out and look at the marks. That was the whole difference. That was the only reason it worked, not rhetoric evidence that could be checked on foot. The Earl left the next morning, unarrested, uncharged, and entirely intact, because Chancery does not arrest earls on a Tuesday. It opens an inquiry which takes years. His schedule stayed as it was. His seat stayed as it was. He stopped his horse beside me on the way out and leaned down and said, pleasantly, warmly, so that anyone 6 feet away would have thought he was thanking me for my hospitality. That was very fine, genuinely. I have not been surprised in 11 years. He gathered his reins. You have not beaten me, of course. You have made me visible, which is a different thing and a great deal more expensive for you than you presently understand. A man in the dark can be patient. A man in the light has to be quick. The warmth never once left his face. So I shall be quick now, Warden. I did tell you I would starve your ground, but you will have noticed that a weed which cannot be starved out is usually pulled by someone else, on someone else's account, for someone else's reasons. He smiled. Do give my regards to Lady Varen. Her father and I have such a great deal to discuss. And he rode away east, toward a castle that a gray tide was going to reach in 11 years. And I stood in the road understanding that I had just won the only fight I could have won, and had made a permanent enemy considerably worse, and that both of those things were true at once, and neither canceled the other. Corvin Ask stayed 4 more days, and walked out to Kessa's marks, and verified them personally at 9 stations with his own hands and his own eyes, which is the most impressive thing any official of that empire ever did in my presence. Then he sat down with me, alone, on the 11th evening, and told me what he was going to write. I am not able to set your tribute low, Warden. Understand that clearly. The schedule is the schedule, your improvement is real, and a man in my position who writes a convenient number is a man who is bought. He poured himself a very small measure of wine. So I have not written a convenient number. I have written a problem. He turned the draft round. I have reported to the Chancery that the western march of this empire is subject to a progressive sterility, advancing at 3 to 5 miles per annum on a northeasterly front, verified by survey. That the Crown may therefore expect the total loss of the Blackmore revenues within a generation, and material threat to the interior thereafter. And I have reported that there exists on that frontier exactly one settlement which is growing, feeding itself, arming itself, and building permanent works in the teeth of it. A dry, dry look. You have made yourself extremely expensive to tax, Warden Vale. You have also made yourself the only thing on that map the Crown will not want to lose. I leave it to wiser heads than mine which of those two facts will matter more. But I will tell you that in 22 years I have never once written a valuation that recommended the Crown invest in a march instead of assessing it, and I have written one this week, and it has ruined my sleep. And the tribute. Raised, as it must be, he allowed himself the ghost of something, payable, however, on the revenues of the march, and I have noted, in a subordinate clause of some length which I flatter myself is rather good, that the Ashmarch's revenues are at present artificially suppressed by exclusive carriage contracts held by a single interested party, and that the Crown cannot reasonably assess a market that has been closed by the very lord who petitioned for the assessment. He drained the small measure. Those contracts will not survive the Chancery, Warden, not because anybody loves you, because the Crown does not permit a man to strangle a revenue it intends to tax. I sat for a moment and let that land. Voss had bought the whole coast to starve me, and by making my market worthless he had made the Crown's own tribute uncollectible, and there is no force in that empire, no army and no aura and no earl, more relentless than a treasury that has been told it may not collect a tax. He had strangled me with the one hand the Crown could see. One more thing. He was packing his ledgers, not looking at me. There is a rumor on this frontier that the Warden of the Ashmarch can do something to the blight that other men cannot. I have heard it 4 times in 11 days from a scout, a smith, a woman who mends nets, and a child. I have not put it in my report. He tied the strap. I am a valuer, Warden. I write what I can verify with my hands and my eyes, and I could not verify that, so it is not Chancery business. But I am also 61 years old, and I have a daughter in the capital, and that gray country is coming toward her at 4 miles a year. He picked up the case. So if it is true, do not let the great houses find out from a rumor. Choose the room you tell it in. Choose it soon. The Chancery's ruling came north in the first week of summer, and the coast contracts broke, and the salt moved, and 1,200 people in a town on a salt flat found out what a year of stockpiled goods is worth on the day the market reopens. We sold everything. Every sack in the warehouse, every sack under the tarpaulin along the quay, at a price the whole coast had been holding its breath on, because Voss's exclusivity had shut out every buyer south of us too, and they had been a year without salt. The treasury went from empty to a figure I had to check twice in under 6 weeks, and Duncairn's second summer began with more coin in it than the whole march had seen in a generation. And on a morning at the end of that first selling week, standing on the quay watching Maeve's crew load the 9th hull in 4 days, the Dominion rose quietly in my vision and gave me a word. Rank, chartered town to barony, held of the Crown, a seat not a post, levy, law, and license. The march has a lord, barony. Not a warden holding a march at an earl's pleasure, a barony, held of the Crown, with the right to raise a levy, hold a court, and license a market in my own name. The thing Voss had spent a winter trying to prove I was illegally building, granted to me in writing by the Chancery that assessed me for building it. Corvin asks subordinate clause of some length, doing its slow work in an office 600 miles away. I read it 3 times. Then I put my hands on the key rail and I stood there for a while, because a year and a half earlier I had stood on a wagon in a burning village with 214 starving people, a title that meant nothing, and 11 days of food. Kasia found me there an hour later with the Chancery instrument in her hand, and an expression I could not read. Do you understand what this actually is? She held it up. This isn't a reward, Aldric. Nobody in that chancery likes you. Half of them have never heard your name. They have granted a barony on the frontier because Ask's report told them the frontier is failing and they need someone standing on it who can hold ground. A small, hard, entirely delighted smile. They have not promoted you. They have garrisoned you. And in doing it, they have accidentally given a discarded third son the legal right to raise soldiers, hold courts and license trade on an 1,100 square mile march that is about to become the most strategically important ground in the empire. And your father. Her face changed slightly. Voss has been at Highmore for 9 days. She said it evenly. He has offered my father a very great deal of money and a marriage alliance for my younger sister, and he has explained at length and with enormous sympathy that my presence in Duncairn is an embarrassment my father can no longer afford. She folded the instrument. My father has written to me twice. I have not opened either letter, and I am not going to, and I would be grateful if you would not ask me about it again for a while. All right. I did not push it, and I did not offer her comfort she had not asked for, because she was not a woman you did that to. I said the only useful true thing instead. The Salt Office needs a permanent factor with authority to sign in her own name, and I've been signing everything myself for a month like an idiot because I didn't want to presume. If you want it, it's yours, and it's real, and it's not charity. You'd be running about a third of this barony's revenue, and I'd be a fool to give it to anyone else. Cassia Varen looked out at the ships for a while. I have spent 11 years being the mind behind a chair I was not permitted to sit in, she said. Do you know what my father said when I asked to be given the correspondence in my own name? He said it would look eccentric. She took the pen out of my hand and signed the manifest on the top of the stack in her own name in her own hard, quick script and handed it to the astonished clerk. There, now it's eccentric. That is the whole of what happened between us that summer, and anyone expecting more of a scene is going to be disappointed. But I noticed that she stopped talking about Highmore as home somewhere around then, and I noticed that I had started, without deciding to, walking down to the Salt Office most evenings on my way back from the works, and that neither of us ever mentioned either thing, and that both of us knew. They sent me to the Ashmarch to vanish. That was 2 years and 3 lifetimes ago. I stood on the wall of a barony in the last light of a good day, and I made myself count it, because a man who never counts what he has built is as much a fool as a man who never counts what he has spent. 1,200 souls, 9 fountains that never stop, 11¼ miles of covered stone carrying water across ground the whole world swore was flat, a wall that beat an earl's steel, and a market the crown itself broke a blockade to protect. A drunk who found his craft, a net mender who found his river, a smith who found his forge, a scout who found she was a surveyor, a steward who came to bury me and stayed to believe, a knight who taught me to hold a fire, a friend who never learned how to leave, a father who has his daughter back, and a woman with emerald eyes who signed a manifest in her own name and did not go home. And arrayed against it, an earl I have made visible, patient, and wounded, and therefore far more dangerous, who is at this moment buying my ally's father. A great empire that has just discovered the frontier is dying, and has garrisoned a discarded son on it because it has nobody better. A gray tide that eats 4 miles a year and does not take coin and does not fear armies. And a cold fire in my chest that is the only thing in the world that tide is afraid of, which is not a gift, as Cassia told me and as I have never forgotten, but the most dangerous thing a man can own, because every great house in the empire will want it, and the ones that cannot have it will want it destroyed. Corvin Ask told me to choose the room I tell it in, and to choose it soon. I have been thinking about that for a month. And I have come to the conclusion that he was right about the urgency and wrong about the choice, because I am not going to tell anyone anything. I am going to build something they cannot ignore, on the only ground in the empire that matters, and then let them come to me. And by the time the great houses work out what I am, the answer is going to be that I am the man standing between them and the end of the world, in a barony they granted me themselves, with a wall they cannot take, a market they cannot close, and 1,100 square miles of dying frontier that only one person alive knows how to hold. Let them send their assessors. Let Voss buy every count on this coast. The gray is 4 miles a year, and it is coming for all of us, and I am the only one of us who has bothered to measure it. And I have always been able to build once I can find the ground. End of Episode 3, The Frontier Crown.